He's not a UFC fighter, but an MMA fighter, Lee Murray.
Lee Murray is one of the most legit gangsters of all time. He really is.
Lee Murray was that crazy English hoodlum. He was a part of the biggest bank robbery in the history of Great Britain.
6 men, some of them masked and armed with handguns.
This is organised crime at its top level. This is planned and executed with military precision.
British police are hunting for a gang that pulled off one of the biggest armed robberies in the country's history.
They had like a movie, full-on tactical gear, machine guns, the whole thing. UFC fighter Lee Murray, who robbed a bank for $90 million.
This story covers the biggest heist in British history, but what makes this robbery even more incredible is that it involved not just criminals, but a man with a world-class reputation as a fighter. The target, the security depot, they take 53 million. The mastermind being none other than UFC fighter Lee Murray. This is how it went down. The plan didn't start on the day of the robbery, it started months before. The gang led by Lee Murray, which consisted of 8 people being Paul, Ian, Chetmere, Roger, Amir, Lee Murray, Stuart and Leah, knew they needed inside access to pull off the heist. The first part of the operation, kidnapping.
He told me to switch off the engine, leave the keys in the car, and started opening my door and asked me to go to the police car, which was immediately behind.
On the morning of the robbery, the criminals posing as English police kidnapped the depot's regional manager, Colin Dixon, and his family during what seemed to be a routine traffic stop to Dixon. They held them hostage for hours, forcing Dixon to help them execute the robbery. The kidnappers made it clear, if he didn't comply, his family would suffer.
No idea what was going on. Well, I'd got a good idea what was going on, I suppose. That a robbery was going to happen, and I was going to have to be part of it.
While Dixon was being held captive, the rest of the gang focused on the security depot. They had inside knowledge of the facility's security systems, and they knew when it was the best time to strike. Amir, a member of the gang who was sentenced to 20 years for his involvement in the plot, also worked at the security depot and filmed the layout of the building through a small camera hidden to his person. On a seemingly normal morning in February 2006, 7 men armed with AK-47 assault rifles, a Scorpion submachine gun, handguns and shotguns took control of the security depot in Tonbridge, England.
On the morning of February the 22nd, 2006, news broke of the biggest cash robbery in British history.
Forget the Great Train robbery, forget the Northern Bank in Belfast. Britain's biggest ever robbery took place in the early hours of this morning in Kent.
They did this via intimidation and our previously discussed kidnapping. The men used a Volvo S20, a car used by the police force in England, with blue lights behind the front grille, imitating a police car to lure Colin Dixon into trusting their word as members of the police force. Little did they know, they were the exact opposite. As the gang held 14 of the workers of the depot hostage, tied up and pretty much helpless, no alarm was set off while the 7 heavily armed men attempted to load cages filled to the brim with banknotes.
The heavily armed robbers burst into the depot and forced the terrified staff into metal cages.
They mean business, no doubt. A number of the employees were convinced that they were going to be killed.
The gang loaded £53 million into their lorry and made their escape, leaving the hostages locked in the depot.
Dressed as members of the police force using firearms, they intimidated and forced their way around the depot, leaving no stone unturned. However, the cages were too heavy to be lifted onto the lorry, so the gang had to do it the old-fashioned way and load the banknotes by hand. They made off with 53 million after the lorry was filled, but had to leave 154 million behind, which was almost 3/4 of the total value of the depot at the time. As this is the second largest cash heist in history, everybody's eyes were drawn to this robbery, as the mission was so high profile that when the CCTV images and film was released to the public, true crime fans watched intently to see these men's next moves.
Do this. He's still in jail right now. He was fighting in the UFC while he was a full-on criminal.
At approximately 2:44 AM, the armed robbers exited the depot as discreetly as possible, and still, no alarm had been triggered. The employees, Dixon and his family, were held, tied up and locked in cages of money.
Colin Dixon was able to raise the alarm half an hour later, kick-starting the police investigation into Britain's biggest cash robbery.
No alarm was triggered until they were sure the robbers had made off at approximately 3:15 AM. As they drove off into the night, you can only imagine how they felt driving off with 53 million of stolen money.
Stealing £53 million is one thing, getting away with it is another. Who would dare to pull off such a brazen crime?
As soon as the news hit the media, it was what can only be described as a frenzy.
To Morocco now, where judges are set to decide today whether a key suspect in Britain's biggest cash robbery will be extradited to stand trial.
The Securitas and their insurers offered $2 million, the biggest reward in British history for information about the robbery. However, the perfect plan didn't come to be so perfectly executed. As the days passed after the robbery, Lee Murray, well-known UFC fighter and well-known hardman, and his right-hand man, Paul Allen, fled to Morocco, where they spent their money extravagantly, bringing attention to both their names.
And Allen had already fled to Morocco, a country with no extradition treaty with the UK. They thought they'd got away with it.
They were living the life of luxury, buying cars, opening bank accounts, they were having companies for. What they didn't bargain on was that we would chase them, and we did.
Also, a white Ford Transit van was brought to their attention and later searched in the parking lot of the Ashford International Hotel. This contained many damning pieces of evidence relating to the crime, such as a balaclava, a Scorpion machine gun, a bulletproof vest, and 2 bags containing $1.3 million in cash stolen from the depot. This van belonged and was registered to a friend of 2 of the robbers. As Lee Murray and Paul Allen spent their money like there was no tomorrow in Morocco, living like kings, attention was being brought to them more and more day by day, until eventually the pair were arrested in a shopping centre in Rabat, Morocco, and thrown in Moroccan jail, where Lee is still serving his time to this day.
To avoid extradition, Lee Murray had claimed Moroccan citizenship. With his millions, he thought he was untouchable, but he was wrong. He was tried in Morocco, where he was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years.
However, Paul Allen, sentenced to 18 years in 2009 for his part in the robbery, was released just after 6 years and 3 months of his sentence. Lee is still serving his 25-year sentence in a Moroccan jail in the northwest of the country. Despite this, he fathered the child from jail in 2010. However, he will not be released until at least 2035. He was sentenced to 10 years in June 2010, which was later extended to 25 years in November 2010. The other criminals didn't receive any lighter sentences than Lee and Paul. Ian was sentenced to 3 years, 9 months, Jetmir was sentenced to life, Roger was sentenced to life, Amir was sentenced to 20 years, Stuart was sentenced to life, and Leah was also sentenced to life. Although all the perpetrators of the robbery were arrested and sentenced, only a mere 21 million of the cash was ever recovered, leaving 32 million unspoken for. This points towards the notion that even though the perpetrators were locked up for heavy sentences, they will be rich upon their release. Does this make the robbery a success in a way? What do you think? This also shows that no matter how famous you are, and no matter what reputation you have, you will always want more.